It is my pleasure to moderate tonight's session on pragmatic clinical trials. Tonight, we're lucky to have with us two leading clinical experts and two of our dedicated patient partners as panelists. Collectively, this session will cover what pragmatic clinical trials are, why they are important, and the crucial role that patients play in shaping them. So as mentioned, please enter your questions in the Q&A at any point, and I will get to as many of them as possible at the end of the session. So as the concept of pragmatic clinical trials is relatively new, we want to first invite you to fill out a quick poll about your current level of understanding. So Marianne will share that poll, and then I'll get started. So while you're filling that out, I would love to kick off the session by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Laura Hopkins. Dr. Hopkins is a professor in the Department of Oncology and a gynecologic oncologist with the Saskatchewan Cancer Agency. She has led several transformative initiatives in Saskatchewan, such as establishing the first ovarian cancer tumor bank and first clinical trial in gynecologic oncology in the province, as well as launching Saskatchewan Cancer Agency's first investigator-initiated clinical pragmatic trial in ovarian cancer. Over to you, Dr. Hopkins.
Okay, hello to all, and thank you for the invitation. Just get my slides here and get started. All right, I'm assuming this is okay. Everyone can see. So yeah, I'm gonna just give an overview of pragmatic clinical trials as they look through my eyes anyway, and through my experience. Pragmatic trials kind of say, the name says what they are. They're very practical and common sense approaches to asking questions at the point of care. And what makes pragmatic trials unique is that they always study the value of an intervention in everyday clinical practice. So those are the two key differences between pragmatic trials and conventional, or I'll say industry-funded trials. Pragmatic trials are really unique in terms of that value purpose, and otherwise can be just the same as any other kind of clinical trial you're familiar with. They can be randomized, blinded, placebo-controlled trials. They can compare two or more different interventions. And one additional unique aspect is that pragmatic trials are often used to study variations in clinical practice. And one of the things that you can appreciate when you're a healthcare provider and when you talk to colleagues across the country is just how much variation there is in clinical practice from place to place. And even within one center, sometimes one person may do things a little differently than another. And studying these variations in clinical practice and trying to reduce variation and bring standardization is always the goal, because through standardized care, we always have much safer and higher quality clinical care. And just to contrast pragmatic versus, I'm going to say industry-sponsored trials, because 90% of all randomized trials for the last 20 years are sponsored by industry. And this is good, and in some ways not so good. The industry spends a lot of money studying drugs and developing drugs, and the vast majority of these drugs are destined to help patients. But one of the things that's just a little bit confounding in their goals is that an overarching goal for industry will be to maximize regulatory approval and commercial impact of their drug. And so sometimes this can affect how trials are designed and what the outcomes are that are prioritized. And with a pragmatic trial, though, we always prioritize outcomes that so-called matter to patients. And those outcomes have been studied, and we know what they are. And it won't be a surprise to anyone listening that overall survival is very, very important, as is quality of life and the promotion of informed patient decision-making, and as well equity in care. Whereas industry-sponsored trials, generally the primary outcome will be something called progression-free survival. And progression-free survival, that third word there, survival, has a little bit too much emphasis on it, in the sense that progression-free survival is not a surrogate for overall survival at all. It simply relates to the time to changes developing on a CT scan. And in terms of an outcome that matters to a patient, time to changes on a CT scan is really not the same as time to reinstitution of therapy, nor is it the same as the time to development of symptoms. And without being a reliable surrogate of survival, then using this as an outcome can sometimes lead to uh, overly optimistic estimates of the benefit of a given drug. The other thing that differentiates pragmatic from industry-sponsored trials is that pragmatic trials have very, very few inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so there may be one or two inclusion criteria and maybe one or two exclusion criteria in a pragmatic trial, so as to be very, very inclusive and more of a come-as-you-are trial. As opposed to industry-sponsored trials, it's not unusual to have 15 to 20 inclusion criteria and 15 to 20 exclusion criteria. And what this speaks to is the fact that the populations from industry-sponsored trials are highly, highly selected and tend to favor the healthiest patients, the most fit patients, and patients that have the fewest number of competing risks. And when you have that many inclusion and exclusion criteria and you select so heavily for your population, then the applicability and the generalizability of your results really gets limited. Pragmatic trials are also much less expensive to conduct than an industry-sponsored trial because we try to superimpose our methods on top of existing clinic visit scheduling. So there are no additional clinic visits. Generally speaking, there's no additional imaging. And so therefore, and fewer data points. So you collect only those data points that are going to reflect the value of the care being studied. And so that brings a lower cost. And also with a pragmatic trial, you can usually get the results, get the study done quicker, whereas industry-sponsored trials can sometimes go on for 5 to 10 years. And so we get faster uptakes of results with pragmatic trials as well, and greater immediate impact for patient care. And then finally, for pragmatic trials, the outcomes are generally replicated in ordinary practice. So this principle of sameness with pragmatic trials and applying to all patients, as opposed to results that apply only to a very select number of patients. So I was asked to just give an example of a pragmatic clinical trial. So I'll give the one that I know the most about because it's a trial that we're running in Saskatchewan. And this is called the 4PDQ trial. And we had to give it a short form because the long name is way too long. Patient preferences for precision medicine, determining optimal quality of life using PARP inhibitors, 4PDQ for short. And so a few years ago, we observed that there was a tremendous variation in practice with respect to the use of niraparib. And there were healthcare providers that were putting everyone on niraparib, and there were some providers that weren't putting anyone on niraparib or even speaking about it. And we felt that in order to make good decisions, or for patients to make good decisions about whether niraparib was right for them, that we should have a standard in Canada to have molecular tumor testing available. And that, for sure, you've probably heard of HRD testing, because it's been a pretty hot topic for about the last year across the country. And we believed strongly that HRD testing should be a standard of care available to everyone in this country. And so we designed a trial to show the value of that test to patients. And the HRD testing is it's basically like a biomarker test. And if you're a patient that has high-grade serous or endometrioid ovarian cancer, then HRD testing will divide patients into two groups. We have a group that has the biomarker that are HRD positive, and we have the other half of patients that do not. And when you use a PARP inhibitor in each of these two scenarios, the benefits are very, very different. And the reason why we thought all this mattered was because that if you were a patient that didn't have the biomarker, and we call that HR proficient, then the benefit of niraparib in that setting was about equal to the harms. And from the PRIMA trial that set the indication for niraparib in the maintenance setting, that so-called, here's that progression-free survival word again, that benefit was just 3 months if you did not have the biomarker. And that so-called benefit was matched exactly by the time spent experiencing some significant side effects. And 40 to 60% of patients who take niraparib from the PRIMA trial developed a serious to life-threatening complication of niraparib therapy, and importantly, no survival benefit. So we really believed that strongly that patients should have this tumor testing available to them so that they could make a decision for themselves as to whether or not it was right for them. And this is just a little study schema, and just to show you that our pragmatic trial, we had basically two inclusion criteria. You had to qualify for a PARP inhibitor, which meant you had serous or endometrioid ovarian cancer, and you had to have had a response to your therapy and agree to tumor testing. And so the tumor testing that we were doing divided patients into those that had a BRCA mutation, for which there's a dramatic benefit to maintenance therapy with olaparib. That was not disputed. There's even a survival benefit. It's a dramatic benefit. We strongly recommended those with a BRCA mutation to have olaparib maintenance. If there was not a BRCA mutation, though, we had patients that had a BRCA-like mutation with a much less progression-free survival benefit than the BRCA mutant group, but still there at about 9 months. No survival benefit, but we would recommend niraparib maintenance to that group. And then it was really the group that did not have the biomarker, the so-called homologous recombinant proficient patients, where we put the patients first, and we developed a patient decision aid. And we worked very closely with the patient partner and research group and some patients in Saskatchewan. And the patients were the drivers of the creation of this document. And it's basically a plain language summary that spells out what the benefits of something are versus the risks. And it allows patients to work through the information for themselves and then to make a decision for themselves as based on their own values and preferences, whether niraparib was right for them. And then we also have planned a cost effectiveness analysis and some other economic outputs. So we had a goal. When we opened the trial, the first patient was enrolled September 16th, 2023, and we wanted to make a case for HRD testing as a standard of care. And just to show you how fast pragmatic trials can change things, 1 year into this study, I had enough data to go to the biomarker committee in Saskatchewan and make a case that we should have HRD testing as a funded standard of care in Saskatchewan. And we were the first jurisdiction in the country to get that. And we had it from last October. Just to give you an idea of how quickly things can change when you have the right kind of value-based information and when you can show your decision makers the value of information to patients. And we changed that standard care by just using the data from the first 10 patients that did not have the biomarker, the proficient group, and we showed the value of the HRD testing. And it was clear to those listening that, in fact, the committee said it was in the no-brainer category of approvals. So we showed the decision makers the value to the patient, and we also showed there were some societal cost savings as well in terms of the drug cost versus the HRD testing cost. And now what we've had is the rest of Canada kind of tumbling along and following along with these approvals, which is amazing. And we're even a test center for some of these places. Saskatchewan is receiving sample from Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, and we do the HRD testing for these other provinces thus far. So it's been a real success story for us here and for patients. And so in summary, I hope you have the idea that pragmatic trials can be done by clinicians using minimal resources. And by the way, our trial didn't really cost us anything, actually. We'd budgeted for the HRD testing initially, but as it turned out, we were able to pivot on the program that was being sponsored by one of the drug companies, and it didn't really cost us a cent. We showed with this pragmatic trial that patient partnership is really the key, and it helps us make sure that we've got clinical information just put the right way and that we're asking the right questions so that the outcomes are relevant and helpful. And also, my experience has been that with Ovarian Cancer Canada's partnership and also with the Society of Gynae-Oncs of Canada, we've got a very supported framework to make pragmatic trials a bit more available to patients across Canada. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hopkins, for providing this overview. So next up, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Helen Mackay. Dr. Mackay is a medical oncologist and professor of medicine at the University of Toronto. She's head of the Division of Medical Oncology and Malignant Hematology at the Odette Cancer Center and senior scientist at the Sunnybrook Research Institute. Dr. Mackay's research involves collaborating with translational and basic scientists in the development and validations of novel therapeutic strategies for gynecologic cancers. Over to you.
This is just such a huge privilege and pleasure to be involved in this evening, and it's very exciting for me. So again, just testing that we've got that up and everyone can see it. Again, just a fantastic topic to talk about, and that introduction and the application Laura talked about is so very important. I'm just trying to get my slides to work. They don't seem to want to.
We can see them. Oh,
yeah, okay, you're working. It was just my end. All right, I will go again. So we've heard a lot about why pragmatic trials are important, and I'm a regular trialist. So a lot of the work I do is with 5-10 page consent forms and that rigidity. But I think, why do we need pragmatic trials? You know, we need to answer questions relevant to patients and family that traditional trials don't address. And you've heard about how important it is to evaluate interventions in real life and real world settings that reflect the diversity of our participants and patients and that go across healthcare borders. And those regular trials don't always allow us to do that. But I would make the point that it's not all or nothing. It is a continuum. And I would argue bringing more pragmatism to all trials is a good thing, especially when patient participation is concerned. I'm going to talk through some of the practicalities about how pragmatic trials are designed and are done. And we do actually have tools, and this is a tool that can be used in discussion as to how to design a pragmatic trial. And essentially, I'm not going through all of these, but if you pick a point there, say recruitment, you can be very explanatory. So regular trials, that it has to be in this center, it has to be done in this way. Or you can be more pragmatic and say, look at novel things like web design, how we get patients into study. And the same you heard from Laura about eligibility. Many criteria or just a few criteria that allows the maximum number of patients and participants for the trial. And this is where patient involvement is so important, because if it's left to people like me, maybe not Laura, I'll veer towards the 5s and less towards the 1s and 2s. So patients play a critical role in ensuring we do the right thing here. We're fortunate in Canada in that we have a number of networks that we have developed, and these are partners that came to us and came through the GOC workshop. There are probably other organizations in the country, but REACT, led by Marie-France and Mark Clemens, has been around in Ottawa for quite a while, and mostly doing breast cancer trials, but keen to involve the ovarian cancer community. And here in Sunnybrook, we have the Impact Surgical organization that looks at pragmatic trials in surgery. There are organizations, if you're interested, out there like Common Sense Oncology that are seeking to make sense and make practical decisions around oncologic care and choosing wisely. And in big letters there, Ovarian Cancer Canada, who are so important in this whole process. So this is a busy slide, but we're going to go through it. And this is actually the REACT process in how you choose a trial and how you work through. So it's a wheel. And you can see those nice teal stars there. And I just wanted to put on stars where patient advocacy is so important in the involvement in this trial. So we're going to go through section by section. So first of all, where do the questions come from? And those questions may come, as Laura's did, from I do this, you do that, why are we doing this? Or patients saying, well, should I have this drug? Should I not? And so it can be about variability in practice. It can be questions such as, is this the right dose for me? Because that trial included people that were 70 kilograms and white, but that's not who I am. Does that relate to me and other changes? And can we make decisions? Pre-medication. Do we always have to give the same thing over and over? Could we make different decisions? And symptom management. And an interesting one that's really coming to the fore at the moment is how long is long enough? Because 2 years of PARP inhibitor or 3 years of PARP inhibitor is designed for the trial, but perhaps you don't need that amount of drug. And I know that there are pragmatic trials in the works looking if you can reduce the duration of treatment, thereby reducing symptom burden. So some important questions. And of course, how do I get followed up? If I am geographically remote to my centers, my virtual follow-up the equivalent of the person in who's being seen every 3 months? Do you need those CTs? So you can answer critical questions that are important in how we deliver care, and also answer questions that are very important to patients and carers through the pragmatic trial structure. What's up next? So I have my idea, or Alicia has her idea, or Laura has her idea. What do we do next? So what we want to do is work out whether that idea resonates. And patient surveys, you might wonder, Ovarian Cancer Canada asks you lots of questions, but these surveys in the context of pragmatic trials matter, because if I've come up with a question, or it's been identified in a survey, does that resonate with anyone else? Because if everybody does the same thing, then there's no point in doing the trial. If it's not an important issue to patients and caregivers, then we shouldn't be doing that trial. And again, to Laura's point, sometimes we have to look for variability in regular practice, and we have to survey and find out if there is a difference about how people are doing things to be able to address that in a trial. In terms of trial design, pragmatic trials have simple endpoints, but sometimes they have endpoints that are different to the regulatory trials of PFS or OS. It might be if I do X, there was a study done with bisphosphonates reducing factors. Does that reduce the number of ED visits that happen? Does it reduce the number of admissions? It might be if this intervention is to help hot flashes, does it increase the number of nights that I'm able to get a good night's sleep? So you can ask different endpoints that patients and caregivers have a real input into what is important. The other piece, we talk about changing practice. If people don't know what's important, then they can't advocate for that. And so publication of these surveys to raise awareness with stakeholders, with Health Canada, that maybe the question that we're answering is important and we need to change practice. So question surveys, we all get survey fatigue, but please, when they relate to these key issues, is this important? It's really great to participate and have that input. So what's up next? Well, trial design, and I think Laura gave a good overview of the fact that we want to keep this simple, relevant endpoints, keep consent simple, because it increases how many people can participate, reduces fatigue in reading this. And critical, as Ovarian Cancer Canada and their patient research partners in research know, being part of the team to feed back on how a study is going and whether it's doing what we set out for it to do that's relevant to patients and families. So in planning a pragmatic trial, again, if it's left to people like me, it'll be quite complicated. But those iterations of making them simpler, cheaper, with routine care are really important. and having easy consent that is accessible whether you're in downtown Toronto and walking into the hospital, or if you are in a more remote area that is based on virtual or web-based. All of this has to be taken into account to keep things simple. So every time it gets revised, with the input of patients and caregivers, we make it simpler. What's up next? Well, when we've gone through our trial, we've done our regular team feedback. To the point that Laura was making, an economic evaluation is important in looking to see whether this makes sense in the economic environment, whether it makes sense from its endpoint, and ultimately knowledge mobilization. We don't change things if people don't know about them. And so organizations like Ovarian Cancer Canada, the GOC, making that knowledge known so that clinicians can change practice, so everybody is aware, and potentially change guidelines, and even perhaps Health Canada approvals for how things are given is critical. We talked a lot about general things, but less about surgery. So just briefly about surgery, and I'm doing this for a very specific reason. There is a lot of variability in practice in how things do, and this group impacts really tries to have a rolling study that addresses simple questions that are important for optimizing care. I really like this, which is they've developed, and this comes out of React work as well, simplified consents. If you're asking a simple question, then having a pictorial way of showing what the question is and what you choose to do, I think is very important. And REBs have increasingly been seeing that this can be done without losing integrity or risking ethical questions. And certainly if English is not your first language, or if like me, you struggle with 5 pages of things to read, I think having this simplified and making it easy and not too burdensome is very important. So I'm going to end on some thoughts and perhaps a big issue where Ovarian Cancer Canada has really stood up. I think that introducing more pragmatism in all trials, and particularly pragmatic trials that answer clinical questions, are a huge opportunity to engage patients and communities in defining what care looks like, and that can be beyond the traditional endpoints. I haven't talked about it, but there is also machine-based learning coming into this space that can create virtual controls, web-based resource utilization, and again, a huge opportunity for accessibility for trials and to reduce traveling and all those things that we try and do and answer questions quickly. We want to overcome bias, and historically, if you have an explanatory trial, one of those regulatory trials, it ends up in a high profile journal with lots of publicity. But I think that it's important to raise awareness about pragmatic trials and just how important they are in defining optimal care. So building bridges with stakeholders is very important. And I think maximal patient and interest group involvement in addressing the questions design and KT is critical, and it allows non-traditional groups that have been not perhaps involved in trials to become involved and define to assist in communities. The elephant in the room is funding, isn't it always? It has been historically challenging to fund truly pragmatic trials. But I think by raising awareness that funding bodies may save money, I mean, we're not doing it to save money, but it may provide solutions that can save money, and making aware that these are important for optimizing and providing patient-centered care is critical. And as you know, Ovarian Cancer Canada had a competition for pragmatic trials and are campaigning hard to get more throughout the country. We've alluded to the partnership with GOC, and this was the Pragmatic Trials meeting that took place in November of 2024, bringing people together. And I think you'll hear a bit more about this, and hopefully forms a platform and partnership that we can do more of these trials like the ones that Laura has put forward. And I'm just showing this picture of these people who have assisted in putting this together and the work they do in setting up trials. So thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Helen. We're going to take questions at the end.
Sure.
But for now, just thank you so much for helping us understand why clinical trials driven by patient priorities are so important. To provide additional insights into this, it is my privilege to welcome Shannon Kadar and Karen Bemister. Shannon and Karen are both dedicated patient advocates and long-term members of Ovarian Cancer Canada's Patient Partners and Research Program. Both were also diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2019, Shannon with high-grade serous ovarian cancer and Karen with endometrioid ovarian cancer. Shannon, Karen, and their patient partner colleague Julie attended the interactive multidisciplinary workshop alongside our clinical panelists and are here to speak about their experiences. So thank you, Karen and Shannon, for joining us today. So, in addition to a quick intro, my first question to you both is why do you think it's important that patients are involved in shaping clinical trials? Shannon, if you could answer first, and then Karen.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you so much for having us here today. So I think it's not just important, it's actually essential for patients to be involved in shaping pragmatic clinical trials because patients live with the real impact of ovarian cancer, the treatments, the effects, every single day. So we see things that researchers and clinicians may not because we are the ones who experience it in real life. Pragmatic trials are designed to evaluate treatments in real-world settings, but you can't claim to reflect the real world if you don't include the voices of the people who live in it, which is us patients. When we are involved from the beginning, we help ensure that researchers are asking meaningful questions and measuring outcomes that actually matter to our daily lives. Most importantly, designing trials that people can actually follow. So without patient input, studies might technically be successful, but practically useless because they miss the realities of things like fatigue and side effects, caregiver responsibilities, transportation barriers, and even things like financial stresses. We may not have a medical degree, but we know what it's like to weigh treatment decisions, to manage symptoms, and to try and maintain a life beyond clinical visits. When patients are at the table, clinical trials become more ethical, more inclusive, and more accessible. They also produce results that are relevant and more likely to be used in real healthcare decisions. In short, involving patients is not just a nice idea. It leads to better research and better outcomes for everyone. It ensures that studies reflect not only scientific priorities, but human priorities too.
Very well said. Karen?
So in the patient partner world, people kept telling us that we were the experts on the disease because we lived it and lived through it. But it never really felt real until this workshop. I think it's important for patients to be part of these trials because who knows better than us what patients in trials and treatments want to get out of the process. Yes, we all want to extend our life, but the question then becomes at what cost? We help to provide those answers to researchers and clinicians because we have the right questions to ask because we've been there. We can provide guidance on how to ask the questions to elicit quantifiable and qualitative responses. We can help obtain valid data, which in turn can help researchers and clinicians develop treatment plans that are centered around patients. And I think that will be real progress that can be made for the effective treatment of the patient and not just the disease.
Thank you, Karen. So my second question with Karen to answer first is, can you share an example of how your input helped a clinician or researcher see things differently at the Pragmatic Clinical Trial Workshop?
So Shannon and I were lucky enough to be sitting at the same discussion tables together. And I think one of our biggest takeaways from that day was seeing the responses when Shannon and I stated that my quality of life definition is different than Shannon's and vice versa, and that ours is different than Jane Doe in Alberta. Because I live 25 minutes away from my cancer center and Shannon doesn't. So her experiences just with logistics alone are varied. Each person's experiences and expectations may be different. Working at the discussion tables, we were able to show the researchers and clinicians how to frame the questions to get measurable data and quantifiable results regarding quality of life. And there was a harder time for some people because we were breaking the norm. But that's what these types of trials are. They are breaking the norm.
Shannon?
So during the conference, like Karen mentioned, one of the things we did was rotating roundtable discussions with researchers and clinicians and a patient partner. So there was a few key points that I felt were so important to the discussion brought forward by us, patient partners. So starting with things like barriers to participation. So I shared that many patients I speak with hesitate to join trials because of practical barriers, like transportation to appointments, lost wages from work, or just the anxiety burden of extra scans and lab works. We talked about ways to minimize these burdens while still incorporating a diverse range of participants. Next, meaningful outcomes. So I encourage the researchers not just to focus on statistics like progression-free survival, but consider that patients also care deeply about the quality of their life, being able to go to work, being able to manage fatigue, or spending quality time with family and friends. Next, inclusive communication. So we discussed that many trial consent forms are written at levels that most people can't easily understand, especially when you're stressed or overwhelmed. I shared how, as a patient, I sometimes didn't understand the language, but I was too embarrassed to ask for clarification. We talked about how researchers could pilot test their trial information materials with real patient partners before finalizing them and making sure that they are clear and easy to understand when passed out in a clinical setting. Next, respect for patient time. So we talked about demanding appointment requirements and how those living in rural areas or juggling employment and childcare responsibilities might back away from trial participation. We brainstormed that some trials might consider replacing in-person visits with a virtual check-in. It was a good example of how a small change in design can make a trial far more accessible to the masses. And lastly, my favorite point of speaking on is emotional impact. So I always reminded these teams that trial participation is not just a physical journey, it's an emotional and an exhausting one. We're scared, we're uncertain, we're pressured to make fast decisions. Many times these trials are our last resort when all else has failed. Can you imagine the range of anxiety and fear that that can produce? That this could potentially be someone's last hope? I believe that sharing my experience opened a deeper discussion about embedding emotional support into trial participation and how important it is to not just collect data and then send someone back out onto the street an emotional wreck with them having to deal with it on their own. Mental health support should not be a luxury in oncology research. Overall, I think that Karen and I and Julie having a seat in these discussions made a real world of difference and offered a perspective to these researchers that they may not have appreciated. I truly believe that some of these researchers will remember our words, will consider our concerns, and make real world changes when they sit down at the desk to design their trials.
Amazing, Shannon. So I want to invite Laura and Helen back to turn your cameras back on. And I do have a few questions that I want to ask from the chat. So I'm going to change one just a little bit, but I think what they're getting at is really important. The question is, I'm very interested in understanding how we as patients even get involved with trials. Do we ask for oncologists, do our own research? Can we only participate in trials that are being led by the hospital we're working with? So I think one thing I want you maybe to elaborate on is if pragmatic clinical trials is a way that we can increase participation regardless of where someone is living, essentially. Laura or Helen, please.
Well, I can give a perspective from where I am. And in Saskatchewan, the Cancer Agency has supports a patient family advisory council. And if a researcher is interested in doing a project and they should always need to, I won't say wants to work with a patient, but needs to work with a patient. All I have to do is send an email and make the request, give a little outline of the project, and then I'll be set up with patients that are very interested in that sort of involvement at the grassroots level. And of course, your group, patient partner and research, I've reached out, as you know, for participation from your group. So I think a structure that's already there makes it so easy. And I think if we want to really support patient partnership with research, we have to set up these groups. We really have to have them there and make it easy so that the researchers can just literally send an email and there we have it, ready to go.
I would say, and I'd be really interested in your perspective, Shannon and Karen. I think it's for researchers to come to you. I think that certainly Ovarian Cancer Canada with research partners provides a platform whereby these questions can be asked about what is important and what should we be doing. We won't be able to do everything, but we can certainly try and network that through the country. I wondered if there was a slightly different question about I think reaching out to Ovarian Cancer Canada, but I wondered if there was a question there about do I have to stay in my cancer center? Can I go somewhere else for trials?
Yeah.
The answer is
Yeah.
absolutely. You can request a referral to another center to discuss clinical trials, but start that conversation with your oncologist. I think as we expand the network of pragmatic trials and develop these ideas in partnership, then I think this will become much more available throughout the country, because it really does provide an opportunity with minimal data collection, that if you're a busy oncologist in Sudbury, that you can get that data in easily, or your patient can enter the data in without needing big infrastructure. So I think it improves accessibility, but as we are at the moment, absolutely have the conversation with your oncologist, and I'm sure that they'd be happy to refer you if to even a virtual appointment with another center.
So I do want to ask as well, there's one question. I'm curious how pragmatic trials can benefit patients who have rare diagnoses, where there are way fewer studies. So if you would like to comment on that as well. Laura or Helen? Oh, there we go.
Okay, I'll go first this time, but I think Shannon and Karen actually have really good perspectives on this. We have many rarer subtypes. I think that in some ways pragmatic trials can make it easier to do rare, because pragmatic trials are not necessarily limited by Canada. You can have registries that are global, that provide information, that can collect data on rarer subtypes. And of course, a lot of questions are relevant to everyone with ovarian cancer in terms of side effects from drugs or management of symptoms. So I think participation in that type of trial, but I think especially allowing accessibility if you're not across the country, potentially for registries for getting questions around to it. I think it's a really really great format for answering questions around rare cancers, because you can network with other countries.
Awesome. So I'm going to ask one more question from the Q&A, and then I'm just going to ask a very general question for whoever wants to answer. I feel like Laura will like this, because it's really how does it fit on the pragmatic scale, and does this fit a pragmatic clinical trial idea? So would exploring the high rates of people having anaphylactic reactions to paclitaxel be a suitable pragmatic trial? There are better options that are not causing medical trauma to us. So could this be made pragmatic?
I didn't catch the very first part of what you said, the anaphylactic with the
High rates of people having anaphylactic reactions to paclitaxel.
how the rights of people?
Rates, high rates.
Okay.
Yes.
Rates of people. I'm not sure. I'm trying to find value in that. Maybe Helen can. But
I was actually thinking, again, back to the surveys, you find out what the variability is of people having reactions and HSR. So, how does one center address that versus the other? And possible questionnaires about access to drugs like nab-paclitaxel that don't have the chemophore that's present, and how that's approached. And then, if there are different ways that that's handled or looked at, then potentially there is a trial where you could look at one approach versus another and look at that in a cost-effective way to see if actually it reduces costs or admissions to hospital or other things? That's just off the top of my head, Laura. I don't know what you think to that.
That's great. Okay, final question in the interest of time. Whoever wants to jump in, I'd love to obviously hear from Shannon and Karen as well. Can you share an example? Oh, wrong one. I apologize. What are your hopes for pragmatic clinical trials for ovarian cancer in the future?
I'd be
Yes,
happy
Shannon,
to
please.
answer that. So my hope for pragmatic clinical trial are simple but crucial. Firstly, I want to see more of them. I want to see trials that reflect the real world that patients are actually living in. So ovarian cancer, as we all know, is not treated in perfect laboratory conditions. It's treated between family dinners, between work demands, between financial stresses, paying the bills, fatigue, and the constant emotional weight of recurrence that's always in the background of our minds. Yet, a lot of these trials are currently designed as if patients have unlimited time, unlimited energy, and resources, and we don't. So that's why pragmatic trials matter. They allow us to ask, can someone realistically stay on this treatment? Does it fit into real life? Can it be delivered in a community hospital, not just a major cancer center? And most importantly, does it improve not only just survival, but the way we feel while we're surviving? So my hope is that pragmatic trials reduce the burden on patients instead of adding to it. Fewer unnecessary clinic visits, lab testing. Can we do things like virtual appointments? These types of practical changes can only happen when patients are part of designing the trials from the beginning. So I think patient involvement is crucial. And I think patients, we see things that maybe these trial designers might miss. And it's not from textbooks, but it's just from lived experience. We live this and we know it. So research will truly only be meaningful when it fits the lives of the people that it's meant to help. So that's why patient partnership in pragmatic trials can't be optional. It has to be essential. And so, just as a side note to every one of the patients that are here right now, don't ever underestimate the difference that you can make as one person. Talk to your doctors, talk to your hospitals, talk to the places that you go, and bring up the point of pragmatic trials. Ask them if they're involved. You know, if all of us patients ask and demand that more of these things happen, we really can make a big difference. And look at Laura's example of her one pragmatic study, the difference that that made. Months and months ago, many of us would have said HRD testing is just not here. It's not in Canada yet. But one little trial made a difference. So please don't underestimate the power of you as one patient and what your voice can do.
Thank you, Shannon. Karen, do you want to quickly jump in
Sure.
there as well?
Very quick. My hopes are quite simple. I want these trials to design research that measures efficacy of treatment and quality of life, and to measure that equally, to truly bring choice to the patients on how their care is being provided, to have quality discussions on what the needs are of the patient before entering trials and treatment.
Thank you, Karen. Helen or Laura, do you want to weigh in? Final words?
Well, I'd like to see pragmatism come to the point of care in a much more scholarly way. I mean, a lot of us believe we're very pragmatic in our day-to-day work, but bringing that formal question and methodology to show value and get those answers, I would like to see that. I think it's going to be a lot of work. The REACT program has been trying to, it's 10 years old. It's supported. They have funding. And it's not an easy thing that has been done and is being done. And breaking across interprovincial boundaries is really not, there's no little task. Now everything comes at a cost, and nothing worthwhile is easy. But a few people can't do this. Like otherwise, it's just going to be little pockets across the country. So that's why I don't think we can do it without the Society of Gynae-Oncologists of Canada really like taking it up and saying, yeah, this means something to us. We think this has value. We're gonna start working on this together with, you know, patient collaboration, and also like, of course, Ovarian Cancer Canada.
Thank you. Final words to Helen, please.
You know, to echo, I think what the other panelists have said, I want to see, you know, better optimized patient-centered care that is holistic. And I think we need pragmatic trials to be able to do that. And I would like to see us build that network to have a rolling structure and collaboration internationally. Laura's right, it's not easy, but then I don't know that anything meaningful ever is. So, you know, I'm just so grateful to all the people here that are listening about this, and to Ovarian Cancer Canada for putting a spotlight on this. And hopefully if everyone feels the same way, we can drive this forward.
Thank you so much, Helen. With that, I'd like to sincerely thank our panelists for generously sharing their time, expertise, and experience and passion.